The space station watchtower floated quietly in the darkness, its metal hull gleaming under distant starlight. Inside the control room, Commander Jake Morrison sat hunched over his desk, nursing his third cup of bitter coffee. The night shift was usually peaceful. Just routine scans of empty space and status reports from nearby colonies. Then the emergency beacons started screaming. The sound cut through the quiet like a knife. Harsh alien tones that made Jake's teeth ache. Red warning. Lights flashed across every screen as the station's computers worked frantically to translate the incoming message. Jake jumped to his feet, coffee spilling across his uniform as he rushed to the main display. The hologram flickered to life, showing wave patterns and data streams that meant nothing to most people. But Jake had been monitoring alien communications for 15 years. He knew desperation when he heard it. "Please, anyone who can hear this message," came the translated voice, soft and musical, despite the terror behind it. The speaker was clearly trying to stay calm, but Jake could hear the cracks forming. "This is Colony Leader Marin of the Zelari settlement on Sanctuary Prime. The Vorthan Empire has broken through our defensive grid." Jake's blood went cold. He knew about the Vorthans. Everyone in the military did. They were the kind of species that made hardened soldiers wake up screaming. They didn't just conquer worlds, they destroyed them slowly, savoring every moment of suffering they could extract. The voice continued, growing more desperate with each word. "They are not targeting our military installations anymore. They are bombing schools, hospitals, residential areas. Our children, ... Oh God, our children are trapped in the lower districts." We have maybe hours before the transmission dissolved into static, then cleared again. This time Jake could hear explosions in the background, the distant wail of emergency sirens, and something that made his hands clench into fists. Children crying, children screaming for their parents. The control room door burst open with a crash that echoed off the metal walls. Captain Lisa Hayes stormed in, her short blonde hair disheveled like she'd been running. She took one look at Jake's face and knew exactly what was happening. "Jake, no. Whatever you're thinking, the answer is no." She moved to stand between him and the communication console. "I know that look. I've seen it before, and it always ends with us in trouble." Jake didn't take his eyes off the display. How long would it take the nearest coalition fleet to reach Sanctuary Prime? Lisa's shoulders sagged. She already knew the answer, and she knew Jake knew it too. 3 weeks. Maybe 4 if they hit supply problems. 3 weeks. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. The kind of tone he used when he was about to do something that would probably get him court-martialed. "Lisa, those people don't have 3 weeks. They don't have 3 days." The transmission crackled back to life, and this time the desperation was impossible to ignore. "The orbital bombardment has begun. They're targeting the evacuation centers. Please, if anyone receives this message, we need help. Our defense fleet is gone. Our planetary shields are failing. In 6 hours, there will be nothing left but ash." Jake turned away from the display and walked toward the door. Lisa grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Command will have our heads if we respond to this," she said. "We're not authorized to engage in military operations. Earth is still on probation with the Coalition. One wrong move, and they'll kick us out of the Alliance completely." Jake stopped walking but didn't turn around. "You're right. Command would be furious. The Coalition would be upset. There would be paperwork and hearings and probably a He finally looked at her, and Lisa saw something in his eyes that made her step back. It wasn't anger or rage. It was something colder, more dangerous. It was the look of a man who had made peace with the consequences of his actions. "But right now, there are children dying while we worry about paperwork." His voice was barely above a whisper, but every word hit like a hammer blow. "There are mothers watching their babies burn while we calculate political costs." The transmission played again, and this time they both heard it clearly. A child's voice, probably no older than 7, calling for help in the background. The sound seemed to echo in the metal room, growing louder and more desperate with each repetition. Jake pulled his arm free from Lisa's grip and headed for the door. Prep the Defiance for immediate departure. Full combat loadout. Jake, please. Think about this. I am thinking about it. He paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. Sometimes you don't wait for authorization, Lisa. Sometimes you don't calculate risks or worry about consequences. Sometimes you just do what's right, and you deal with everything else later. The emergency beacon continued its desperate cry. As Jake disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps echoing like drumbeats in the darkness of space. The Defiance screamed through hyperspace like a bullet fired from the barrel of hell itself. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Carter felt his bones rattle as the ship's experimental engines pushed reality to its breaking point. His knuckles were white as he gripped the arms of his command chair, fighting against forces that should have crushed him flat. The bridge around him was a nightmare of flashing red lights and warning alarms. Every surface vibrated with barely controlled energy as the ship's hull groaned under the strain. Carter had served on dozens of vessels during his 20-year career, but he'd never felt a ship fight this hard against the laws of physics. Status. Report. He barked over the screaming engines, his voice barely audible above the chaos. Chief Engineer Patricia Wells looked like she was being pressed into her console by an invisible giant. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she struggled to read her instruments through the violent shaking. Sir, we're running the hyperspace drives at 130% capacity. The engine core temperature is in the red zone, and we've got microfractures forming along the hull. Carter's jaw clenched. He knew what those numbers meant. They were pushing the Defiance beyond anything it was designed to handle. The ship was literally tearing itself apart around them. The Coalition engineers told us that anything over 110% was impossible. Wells continued, her voice strained. They said the drives would explode, the hull would collapse, and we'd be scattered across 3 star systems. The Coalition engineers, Carter growled back, his words coming out in short bursts as the acceleration pressed against his chest. Never had to listen to children screaming while they ran their safe little calculations. Behind the Defiance, 6 human destroyers and 2 assault carriers followed their flagship into what most species would call suicide. Every ship in the small fleet was crewed by volunteers who had ignored direct orders from Earth Command. When word had spread about the mission to Sanctuary Prime, over 3,000 military personnel had volunteered. Carter had to turn away 2/3 of them. The main screen at the front of the bridge showed something that shouldn't exist. Space itself was folding and twisting like liquid metal, bending in ways that made Carter's eyes water just to look at. Streams of light stretched and compressed as the fabric of reality warped around their ships. Normal hyperspace travel was like swimming through thick water. This was like being shot from a cannon while riding a lightning bolt. The Defiance was compressing a 3-week journey into 4 days of pure torture that would have killed most alien species in the first hour. How are the other ships holding up? Carter asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lieutenant Danny Brooks, barely 25 years old and looking green around the gills, checked his communications panel. The Retribution is reporting stress fractures in their engine housing, but they're holding together. The Vengeance lost 2 crew members to acceleration sickness, but their medical bay has them stable. Carter nodded grimly. Acceleration sickness was what happened when a human body was pushed beyond its limits for too long. Blood pooled in the wrong places, organs shifted, and bones felt like they were being crushed by invisible hammers. Most alien species would have died from it within minutes. But humans were different. Humans were stubborn. They had evolved on a world that had tried to kill them in every possible way, and they had learned to endure things that should have been impossible. The communication system crackled to life, cutting through the engine noise like a voice from the grave. "This is Admiral Thompson, to all fleet vessels." The Admiral's voice sounded strained, but there was steel underneath the exhaustion. We're 12 hours out from the Zalari system. I want every weapon system charged and ready. I want every Marine checking their equipment. When we drop out of hyperspace, we're going in hard and fast." Carter felt a grim smile cross his face, despite the pain racking his body. Admiral Thompson was 62 years old and had been fighting wars since before Carter was born. If anyone could lead them through this impossible journey, it was her. "Sir," Wells called out, her voice tight with concern, "the engine core is showing signs of critical instability. We might have to reduce power." "Negative," Carter replied without hesitation. "We maintain current speed. How long can the engines hold?" Wells ran quick calculations on her console, her fingers dancing across holographic displays, even as the ship bucked around her like an angry horse. Best case scenario: 14 hours before complete failure. Worst case: the core could collapse in the next 30 minutes. Carter looked at the twisted space on the main screen, then at his crew, struggling to do their jobs under impossible conditions. These were good people, brave people, who had volunteered to risk everything for strangers they'd never met. They deserved to know the truth. "Listen up, everyone," he announced to the bridge crew. "We're riding the edge of disaster here. Our engines might explode, our hull might collapse, and we might all be dead before we reach Sanctuary Prime." He paused, letting that sink in. "But right now, there are children on that planet who are counting on us. They don't know our names, they don't know we're coming, but they're counting on us anyway." The shaking seemed to lessen slightly, or maybe Carter was just getting used to it. Around him, his crew straightened in their chairs, despite the crushing forces pressing down on them. "We're going to make it," he said, and somehow, despite everything, he believed it. "We're going to get there in time, and we're going to save those people, because that's what humans do when innocent lives are on the line." The Defiance continued its impossible journey through the void, carrying hope across the darkness of space at a speed that should have killed them all. The war room aboard the Defiance was deadly quiet, except for the soft hum of holographic displays, casting blue light across grim faces. Major General Robert Davis stood at the center of it all, his weathered hands resting on the tactical table, as data streams painted a picture that made his stomach turn to ice. The main display showed Sanctuary Prime from orbit, and what Davis saw there would stay with him for the rest of his life. Vorthan warships hung in space like black spiders, their weapon platforms methodically firing down at the planet's surface. Where once there had been cities full of life, now there were only expanding circles of fire and ash. Davis had been a soldier for 32 years. He'd fought pirates in the outer colonies, put down 3 separate rebellions, and seen more death than any one man should have to witness. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was something else entirely. "Give me the breakdown," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Intelligence Officer Amanda Brooks looked up from her console, her face pale as fresh snow. She was barely 30 years old, brilliant with languages and code breaking, but nothing in her training had prepared her for what she'd been listening to for the past hour. "Bob, the Vorthans aren't following any standard invasion protocol," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "They're not trying to capture strategic locations or preserve infrastructure. They're systematically destroying everything that matters to the Zalari people." Davis watched the orbital bombardment continue, each flash of light representing hundreds of lives snuffed out in an instant. "Show me the target analysis." The holographic display shifted, highlighting the impact. Sites across the planet's surface. Davis felt his blood turn to ice water as the pattern became clear. Schools, hospitals, residential areas, places of worship, cultural centers. Everything that made the Zalari civilization what it was. They hit the military installations first. Standard procedure, Brooks continued, her voice growing steadier, as she focused on the facts. But once the defense grid was down, they switched targets completely. They're going after civilian population centers, but not randomly. They're specifically targeting areas where families gather. What about the communications intercepts? Davis asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Brooks hesitated, her fingers hovering over the control panel. Sir, you need to understand that what I'm about to play isn't just military chatter. These are personal conversations between Vorthan officers. She activated the audio feed, and the translated Vorthan voices filled the room with casual evil that made everyone present feel sick to their souls. I bet you 50 credits the school collapses before the hospital, came the first voice, speaking, with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. You're on, replied another, but I think we should target the playground first. Maximum psychological impact, when the parents see it on the news feeds. Laughter echoed through the speakers. Actual laughter at the thought of murdering children. Davis felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest. Around the room, his officers were having similar reactions. Lieutenant Tommy Walsh, who had 3 kids of his own back on Earth, was gripping his console so hard his knuckles had gone white. Captain Jenny Martinez was staring at the display with the kind of expression usually reserved for looking at poisonous snakes. The Vorthan voices continued their casual discussion of atrocities. They debated whether it was more effective to kill parents first and leave the children orphaned, or to kill the children and leave the parents to suffer. They made jokes about the sounds the Zalari made when they died. They complained that the bombardment was going too quickly, and they wouldn't have enough entertainment to last the whole day. Turn it off, Davis said quietly. But Amanda was already reaching for the controls. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely operate the console. There's more, Bob, hours of it. They're not just conquering these people, they're torturing them for fun. They're making it last as long as possible, because they enjoy watching them suffer. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence that comes before a storm, heavy with electricity and the promise of violence. Davis had seen war crimes before. He'd prosecuted soldiers who had lost their humanity in the heat of battle, who had done terrible things in moments of fear or rage or desperation. But this wasn't that. This was calculated cruelty. This was evil that had looked at itself in the mirror and decided it liked what it saw. He looked around the room at his people. These were good soldiers, trained professionals, who followed rules of engagement and understood the difference between military necessity and mindless brutality. But right now, he could see something changing in their eyes. The same thing that was changing in his own heart. Sir, said Captain Rodriguez from the communications station, we're getting more distress calls from the surface. Survivors are broadcasting from underground shelters, begging for help. Davis nodded slowly, his mind already shifting into a different mode of thinking. A darker mode that he'd hoped never to need again. Change of mission parameters, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The words came out calm and measured, but everyone in the room could hear the iron underneath. This is no longer a rescue operation. He looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. What he saw there reflected what he felt in his own soul. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were something much more dangerous. This is an extermination, he continued, and the words seemed to hang in the air, like a declaration of war against the darkness itself. Every Vorthan ship in this system dies. Every Vorthan officer who participated in this gets put on trial for crimes against sentient life, and if any of them resist arrest, we make them regret it. The room erupted in quiet acknowledgments and nods of agreement. These weren't bloodthirsty people looking for an excuse for violence. These were protectors who had seen something that offended their very souls, and they were prepared to do whatever was necessary to stop it. Davis turned back to the tactical display, already planning the attack that would turn the Vorthan celebration into their worst nightmare. Captain Jennifer Walsh felt the universe shift around her as the Defiance tore through the fabric of hyperspace and materialized in normal space, like a ghost becoming solid. The transition from the twisted nightmare of faster-than-light travel to the cold reality of the Sanctuary Prime system hit her like a physical blow, but she was already moving before the ship had fully stabilized. "Battle stations," she called out, her voice carrying across the bridge with the authority of someone who had spent 15 years learning how to kill efficiently. "All weapons online. Launch bays open. This is not a drill." Around the Defiance, 6 destroyers and 2 assault carriers dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation, spreading out like the fingers of a closing fist. These weren't random ships thrown together for a desperate mission. These were vessels that had trained together, fought together, and learned to move as one deadly organism. The Vorthan fleet hung in orbit around Sanctuary Prime like a cluster of poisonous insects, their black holes gleaming with the fires of the cities they were destroying below. They had been so focused on their systematic slaughter of the Zalari people that they hadn't bothered to post proper lookouts. Why would they? The nearest coalition forces were weeks away, and no one else in the galaxy was stupid enough to challenge the Vorthan Empire. They had never encountered humans before. Walsh studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating distances, weapon ranges, and kill zones. The Vorthines had 43 ships in the system, including 8 heavy cruisers and what looked like their flagship, a massive dreadnought that was probably coordinating the orbital bombardment against any other species. Those odds would have been impossible. The humans were outnumbered 5-1, outgunned, and operating at the end of a supply line that stretched across half the galaxy. By every reasonable calculation, they should have turned around and gone home, but humans had stopped being reasonable the moment they heard children screaming. "Weapons status," Walsh called out. "All railguns loaded and charged," reported Lieutenant Billy Hayes from the weapons console. "Missile bays are armed. Point defense systems are active. Target acquisition complete," added Ensign Katie Murphy. From Tactical, "We have firing solutions on all enemy vessels." Walsh smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator that had found prey. "Colonel Parker, you have authorization to engage." From his position at the Fleet Command Station, Colonel Steve Parker's voice cut through the bridge chatter like a blade through silk. "All units, execute protocol, Shepard. I repeat, execute protocol, Shepard." The words sent a chill through every human in the fleet. Protocol Shepard wasn't just a battle plan. It was a philosophy of war that humans had developed over thousands of years of fighting each other, refined through countless conflicts, and perfected in the fires of their own violent history. It meant complete and total victory. It meant no enemy survivors. It meant that when the battle was over, there would be no one left to tell the story from the other side. The Defiance opened fire first, its main railgun sending a tungsten projectile screaming through space at a significant fraction of light speed. The Vorthan cruiser it hit simply ceased to exist, torn apart by kinetic energy that released more power than a small nuclear weapon. The alien fleet reacted exactly as their training had taught them. Energy shields came online, weapons swiveled to return fire, and their formations shifted into defensive positions that had served them well against dozens of other species. But humans didn't fight like other species. Where the Vorthans expected energy beams that their shields could deflect, they met solid projectiles that punched through their defenses like they were made of paper. Where they anticipated conventional tactics that followed the accepted rules of galactic warfare, they faced opponents who fought with the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of perfecting the art of killing. Human destroyers didn't engage in the polite, long-range dueling that most species preferred. They closed to knife-fighting distance and unleashed hell from point-blank range. Human assault carriers didn't wait for their fighters to engage enemy squadrons in graceful aerial ballet. They launched their attack craft in swarms that fell on Vorthan ships like angry wasps, stinging them to death with thousands of small wounds. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted exactly 17 minutes. Walsh watched the tactical display as enemy contacts winked out one by one, each disappearing light representing hundreds of Vorthan lives snuffed out in an instant. Part of her, the part that had been trained at the military academy to value honor and follow the rules of war, felt sick at the slaughter. But a larger part, the part that had listened to those intercepted transmissions of Vorthans laughing as they murdered children, felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Captain," called out Lieutenant Hayes, "the Vorthan flagship is trying to surrender." Walsh looked at the main screen, where the massive enemy dreadnought hung dead in space, its engines destroyed and its weapons offline. She could see escape pods launching from its hull as the crew abandoned ship. "Colonel Parker," she said into her communicator, "the flagship is requesting quarter." Parker's response came immediately, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "Negative. No quarter asked, none given. These are war criminals, not soldiers." The Defiance's main guns spoke again, and the Vorthan flagship joined its escorts in death, as the last enemy ship exploded in a brief flower of fire, and Metal, the human fleet, received a final transmission from the Vorthan command structure. It was a panicked message, broadcast on all frequencies, meant as a warning to the Vorthan Empire about what they had encountered in the Sanctuary Prime system. "Unknown human vessels," came the terrified voice of what was probably the enemy fleet commander, speaking his last words as his ship died around him. "They don't fight like any species we know. They don't follow the accepted protocols of civilized warfare. They fight like apex predators. They fight like death itself." The transmission cut off as the last Vorthan ship was reduced to cosmic dust. In the sudden silence that followed, Walsh looked down at the planet below, where fires still burned in the ruins of Zalari's cities. They had arrived too late to prevent the massacre, but they had arrived in time to make sure it never happened again. "Colonel Parker, to all ships," came the voice over the communications array. "Sanctuary Prime is secure. Begin search and rescue operations immediately. And someone, send a message to the Galactic Coalition. Tell them the humans have arrived." The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Coalition stretched out before Ambassador Helen Martinez like a vast cathedral made of crystal and light. Representatives from 200 different worlds sat in curved rows that spiraled upward toward a domed ceiling that showed the stars themselves. She had walked into this chamber countless times over the past 5 years, but today felt different. Today, every alien eye in the room was focused on her with a mixture of fear, respect, and something that might have been horror. Martinez straightened her dark blue diplomatic uniform and walked to the speaker's podium at the center of the hall. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with sharp, precise sounds that echoed in the sudden silence. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. What happened in the next hour would determine humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. The Altarian representative rose from his seat, his crystalline body catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. His species had been part of the coalition for over 1,000 years, and his voice carried the authority of ancient civilization. "Ambassador Martinez," he began, his words translated by the hall's computers into a dozen different languages simultaneously. "We are here to discuss your species' recent actions in the Sanctuary Prime system. The complete destruction of the Vorthan invasion fleet has sent shockwaves through civilized space." Martinez nodded calmly. She had been expecting this conversation since the moment the last Vorthan ship exploded. "I'm here to answer any questions the Assembly might have." Questions? The Altarian's form shimmered with what Martinez had learned to recognize as indignation. "Your species eliminated an entire enemy force. 43 ships, thousands of crew members, wiped from existence without a single attempt at negotiation or surrender." A murmur ran through the assembled representatives. The Corallian delegate, whose people resembled giant butterflies, fluttered her wings nervously. The Torgan ambassador, built like a walking tree, creaked ominously in his seat. Even the usually calm Etherean representative, more energy than matter, pulsed with agitation. Martinez let the silence stretch for a moment, then spoke in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the vast hall. The rules of engagement that govern coalition military actions, she said slowly, assume that your enemy follows the same basic principles of civilized warfare that we do. They assume that your enemy distinguishes between military and civilian targets. They assume that your enemy has some concept of mercy, some understanding that there are lines that should never be crossed. She paused, touching a control on the podium. A holographic display materialized above the assembly, showing intercepted Vorthon communications from the Sanctuary Prime system. The Vorthons were not following those rules, Martinez continued. They were not conducting a military operation. They were conducting systematic torture of an entire population for their own entertainment. The hologram shifted, showing translated text of the Vorthon transmissions. Martinez watched as alien faces throughout the hall registered shock, disgust, and growing understanding. The butterfly-like Corellian representative actually recoiled from her seat. They made bets on which schools would collapse first. Martinez read from the display. They debated whether it was more fun to kill parents or children. They complained that the slaughter was going too quickly because they wanted to enjoy it longer. The Torgan delegate's wooden features creaked as his expression hardened. This cannot be accurate. I have 17 hours of similar communications, Martinez replied, all verified by 3 independent translation services. The Vorthons weren't conquering Sanctuary Prime, they were torturing it to death, one building at a time, one family at a time, because they found the suffering of innocent people to be amusing. She changed the display again, this time showing images from the rescued Zelari settlements. Alien children played in temporary shelters, while their parents worked to rebuild homes destroyed by orbital bombardment. Human soldiers could be seen. In the background, standing guard with weapons ready. You want to know what humans do when children are threatened? Martinez asked, her voice growing stronger with each word. We become something terrible and necessary. We become the nightmare. That nightmare's fear. We become the monster that eats other monsters. The Altarian representative flickered uncertainly, but the scale of destruction, Surely some of those Vorthons could have been rehabilitated, taught to know. The word cut through the hall like a blade. Martinez had spent 3 days preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she found that all her diplomatic training was unnecessary. The truth was simple enough that even a child could understand it. Some actions cannot be forgiven, she continued. Some crimes are so terrible that they remove the perpetrator from the community of civilized beings. The Vorthons made their choice when they decided to torture children for fun. We made ours when we decided to stop them. The hall fell silent again, but this time it was different. It was the quiet of people grappling with concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about morality and justice. The Etherean representative spoke next, her energy form pulsing with careful thought. What you describe sounds less like military action and more like vengeance. Martinez smiled, and there was something cold in the expression. Sometimes vengeance and justice look exactly the same. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent life is to completely destroy those who would harm it. Hours of debate followed. Representatives argued about proportional response, the sanctity of life, and the proper procedures for dealing with war criminals. They discussed rehabilitation programs and the possibility of redemption. They quoted ancient philosophical texts and modern legal precedents. Martinez listened to it all with growing impatience. These were good people, representatives of civilizations that had largely outgrown the capacity for the kind of violence that humans still carried in their hearts. But their goodness, their civilized nature, had left them unable to comprehend pure evil when they encountered it. Finally, as the debate wound down, the assembly reached its decision. They could not condone humanity's actions. But they could not condemn them either. Instead, they did something unprecedented in coalition history. They created a new classification: protector species. The designation came with privileges that no other member race enjoyed. Humans could respond to distress calls without prior authorization. They could engage in military operations without coalition oversight. They could make decisions about threats to innocent life without waiting for committee approval. But it also came with a burden that weighed heavier than any privilege. Other species would call on humanity when civilization faced something so terrible that normal methods were inadequate. They would ask humans to do the things that civilized people could not do themselves. As Martinez left the assembly hall, she carried with her the knowledge that humanity had found its place in the galaxy. They were the species others called when the darkness grew too deep, when evil wore a smile and fed on suffering. They were the ones who would walk through hell to defend those who could not defend themselves. It was a terrible responsibility. But as she thought about the Zellery children playing safely in their rebuilt homes, Martinez knew it was a burden worth carrying. The universe had just learned that there were beings willing to become monsters to protect innocence, and somehow, that made the galaxy a little bit safer.